Okay, so we asked for intense deep dives, and you definitely delivered.
Yeah,
Wow,
this one's a doozy.
this research paper, Maternal Gatekeeping, Legal and Professional Malfeasance, it doesn't pull any punches, does it?
No, it really doesn't. It jumps right in, doesn't it, with some really strong accusations. Like right off the bat, they're talking about how both the legal system and the mental health system, are failing to address this thing they call maternal gatekeeping.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard hitting from the very beginning. They start with this really tragic story about a court case, White v. White, where a father actually took his own life.
Yeah.
And they're saying that this was after years of what they call false allegations, and basically the mother like constantly shutting him out of their child's life.
Yeah, using that to illustrate their point, right? The human cost of what they see as this systemic failure to recognize and then actually address maternal gatekeeping.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not just anecdotes like that, right? They get into a lot of research
Right.
to back up their claims.
Absolutely. They cite studies, like one by Ganong, Coleman, and Chapman, from 2018, I believe it was, that found that mothers are way more likely to exhibit what they classify as these gatekeeping behaviors than fathers.
And they even break down those
You
behaviors
do, yeah.
with like percentages, right?
Yeah, they pull those right from that Ganong study. 65% of mothers were found to control access to the child in some way, or, like restricting visitation or creating these conflicts, compared to only 35% of fathers.
See, those numbers are way more jarring than I think I was expecting.
Yeah, and they use those statistics to build this argument that this isn't just, moms and dads disagreeing sometimes, right?
Mm.
They're saying this is a pattern of behavior that's really rooted in these societal biases
Mm.
that often favor mothers as caregivers. Like it or not, that's kind of ingrained in our culture.
Yeah, and then they go even further to say that by ignoring this, like when the courts ignore it, they're essentially ignoring basic parental rights.
Right. Which stems back to some pretty important legal precedents, right? They bring up Troxel v. Granville Supreme Court case, which really solidified that both parents have equal rights when it comes to raising their kids.
Okay, so are they saying that, like, if the courts aren't addressing this, they're basically saying the courts are violating those rights?
That's exactly what they're saying.
Wow.
And, they're saying it can have some really serious consequences. And it's not just for the parents, it's for the kids involved, too.
This is fascinating because they're not just pointing fingers at, like, the legal system here, right?
Right.
They also call out mental health professionals. They say they have a responsibility to do a better job of recognizing this and dealing with it, especially when it comes to things like custody evaluations.
And they use some strong language, don't they, when describing what they see as this failure by these professionals.
Yeah. Professional malfeasance, what is that? Like, what are they actually saying there?
So malfeasance, it means essentially wrongdoing or misconduct, right? So they're saying that by not using the research and tools available to them, mental health professionals are failing to uphold their professional duty. And by not doing that, they're potentially causing harm.
So they're saying that by not recognizing this and not using the tools available to them, they're actually doing something wrong.
Yeah. And they specifically call out this thing called the parental gatekeeping scale, the PGS,
Hmm.
that's designed to measure these behaviors. And they're saying it's like often overlooked.
So instead of relying on something like that that's more objective, they're relying on these outdated assumptions.
Yeah, and they go on to connect these behaviors to some really serious consequences for kids.
Okay, like what?
They even use this term like a toxic gatekeeping environment that some children end up in.
So what does that mean? Like, what are we talking about here? What kind of impact?
Well, they cite studies that link it to things like, increased anxiety and depression in kids, even like suicidal thoughts and behaviors.
See, that's where it's like, okay, this isn't just parents fighting, right?
Yeah.
This is like actual harm to the child.
Exactly. And they highlight research, Johnston, Roseby, and Coonley, that found some pretty strong evidence of this kind of psychological impact on kids exposed to this parental alienation.
Yeah, and this is where it's like this really hits home because it's not just about the parents and like the legal battles and parental rights.
Mhm.
It's about the kids.
And they actually say that a lot of this is preventable, right? Like if the legal system and mental health professionals would acknowledge it and take action, a lot of these negative outcomes could be avoided.
So what kind of action are we talking about here? Like what needs to happen?
Well, for one, they advocate for shared parenting arrangements where both parents are meaningfully involved in their kids' lives.
Okay.
They believe that would be way more beneficial than the current system that often favors one parent over the other.
Yeah, if you're really trying to put the child's best interest first, shouldn't both parents, as long as they're fit and able, have a real chance to be involved to
Exactly.
raise their kid?
Yeah. And they even go a step further and say, like, the courts need to get a lot tougher on enforcing visitation orders because apparently the current system kind of lets these gatekeeping behaviors slide, and there's very few consequences for the parent who's doing it.
But isn't that kind of a slippery slope, though? Because how do you decide what's gatekeeping and what's just a parent making a judgment call about what they think is best for their kid? Like, there's a lot of room for interpretation there.
Oh, absolutely. And they acknowledge that in the paper, but they're saying we already have tools and research to make better decisions.
Right.
They keep coming back to these standardized assessments like that PGS.
So, like, instead of just relying on someone's opinion or these old ideas about mothers and fathers, we need to have more proof that this is actually happening.
Yes, and that's where mental health professionals come in. They're calling for a more rigorous and honestly a more balanced approach to custody evaluations.
So you're evaluating both parents, not just automatically assuming it's one or the other.
Yes, and those evaluations should be rooted in research and they should be conducted with these tools that can like hold up in court.
So the decisions about custody or visitation are actually what's best for the kid.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that while there are definitely cases where one parent might be unfit or dangerous, there's also times when those labels are used unfairly, and that can have huge consequences.
It really makes you think about just the weight of all this,
Yeah.
and how important it is to get these decisions right.
Yeah, it's a lot. And it can be overwhelming to think about, especially, if you're someone going through a custody dispute yourself.
Yeah.
I think the biggest takeaway, for me at least, from this whole paper is just awareness.
Of what do we need to be aware of?
Well, awareness that these biases exist, even in systems that are supposed to be set up to protect children.
So like being aware that these biases exist, not just out there in the system, but even in ourselves.
Exactly. And it's not about, assuming that everyone is out to get you or whatever, but it's about approaching these situations with open eyes,
Asking questions.
asking questions.
Being willing to challenge some of those assumptions.
100%. And like if you're a parent going through this, document everything.
Ooh, that's good advice.
Visitation schedules, communication logs, any instance where you feel like you're being excluded or unfairly portrayed, write it down.
So that if it does end up in court, you have all that.
Exactly.
You're
And
welcome.
don't be afraid to advocate for yourself
Yeah,
and what you believe is in your child's best interest.
that's right.
If you feel like your concerns aren't being heard, talk to another attorney, get a second opinion, a mental health professional.
Get another professional involved.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's about being informed, being proactive, and like we've been saying this whole time, putting the child first.
Yeah, at the center of every decision.
That's it, yeah. This paper, it's tough to read, but it's about protecting children and making sure that they have a chance to have these healthy relationships with both parents.
If at all possible.
Yes, exactly.
Well, this has been
A
a
lot.
lot to unpack, I'll say that.
Yeah.
But it's definitely given us a new perspective on this whole maternal gatekeeping thing, the legal battles, and, most importantly, I think, the human stories
Yeah.
behind all of it.
It just highlights how important it is to have these open and honest conversations, even when they're difficult.
Oh, for sure. Because there's a lot at stake here.
Yeah.
Well, listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about. This paper raised some really, I think, challenging questions about potential biases within the system and, the very real impact they can have on families.
It really shows how these biases can play out
Yeah.
in the real world.
And how important it is to kind of be aware of that
Yeah, the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to navigate these situations.
and advocate for the best possible outcomes
Yes,
for these families.
100%.
And on that note, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this deep dive. But listener, we encourage you to keep exploring these issues.
Keep the conversation going.
Yeah, and be an advocate for fairness and for the well-being of these kids.
Absolutely.
Okay. Listener, we want you to consider this. This paper focused on maternal gatekeeping. But what about other forms of parental alienation? Could there be biases in the system that work against fathers too, or even against other caregivers? It's definitely something to think about as we continue to learn more and kind of like evolve our understanding of these really complex family situations.